Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to get started. My name is Rob Duncan, Associate Dean Research, and it's my pleasure here today to introduce Dr. Derek Brewin to our faculty seminar. So, pleasure to have Derek here. As many of you know, he's a professor and head in the Department of Agribusiness and Ag Economics within our faculty here, of course. His recent research has focused on spatial grain and oilseed markets, as well as innovation in crops. Derek is a fellow and past president of the Canadian Agricultural Economics Society, a director of Farm Management Canada, and a chair of the Saul Sinclair Institute for Farm Management. Prior to his academic career, Derek had worked at the Canadian Wheat Board, which I was aware of, but also Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Farm Credit Corporation. And Derek was raised on a mixed irrigation farm in Purple Springs, Alberta. And we were talking before how it's a little different terrain than when he started growing up there. So pleasure to have you here today, Derek. Let's welcome Derek.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all for coming. I want to start with acknowledgement that the University of Manitoba campuses are on spaces located in the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Inuit, Assiniinawak, Dakota, Ayote, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. One of the mistakes of the past I want to point out is that we just made it in recent months, we have not taken a long-term view of the benefits of some of the things we invest in. And I know that sometimes physical scientists feel like we're making short-term economic decisions that wreck long-term capacities in soils and things like that. And that's just bad economics. We're not taking the long-term view of the economic costs and gains of what we're gonna work on. And I'm going to touch base on that, partly because the president was in our faculty council the other day, and it is something that has informed my research most of my career, is the importance of the agricultural research stock and its impact on innovation. And I haven't done lots of this myself. I've worked a little bit on the economic gains of the canola hybrid varieties and herbicide tolerance. I've looked at the benefits of that innovation, but a whole bunch of the more general work was done by Julian Alston at University of California, Davis, and Phil Pardee at the University of Minnesota. Those two have kind of done a lot of the heavy lifting and led to a lot of research in similar areas. Richard Gray and Strarula Mala have done a bunch of that work on the returns to checkoffs from producer groups. And then most recently, Yu Jin at Shanghai University and Wallace Huffman at Iowa State have updated some of the work by Julian and Phil originally. Just to go through what the comments were when Alston and Pardee and Anderson and James did their first study in 2000. They looked at 292 estimates of the returns from agricultural research around the world. Their average internal rate of return was 80%. Now, internal rate of return is something that could be compared to deposit rates. So 80% is a ridiculously high number. And so even Alston is skeptical that the number is that high, but I'll present a case later that I think it's not, way out of whack. The lowest they measured was 18% return, internal rate of return. Gray and Mala looked at the Canadian studies. Their internal rate of returns ranged from 20% to 101%. And then in the most recent 2016 study by Jin and Huffman, the internal rate of return for research, average research budgets in states and federal government of the US was 65% internal rate of return. And the return to extension, which is really, there's an entire extension service in the US that's budgeted, and they have better budgets than us, their number would be higher, but the internal rate of return of that investment is even better than research. So for those of you who do extension, you actually have often delivering a bigger bang for your time than your original research was. I know some of you care a lot about your research, but in terms of anything that can have an impact on farm management choices, that extension is really, really valuable. I just wanted to put a plug in for that and for the extension service in the provincial government. Okay, why we talk about internal rates of return, it's because the research effort in agriculture takes years. So in this one, it's about 18 years of research costs over time, followed by decades of benefits. Some of the decades start before the research is finished, as early adopters are starting to use the material. But when we're trying to assess that, as we're going through time, general prices are adjusting, the price of the crops are adjusting, and so we have to take on accounting practices that allow us to compare the present value of these costs to the present value of these future benefits. All of the things that they were looking at were actually back in time, so there were this cost in if it was in 2000 or $1980, that was more expensive than the benefits that have, because of inflation, than the benefits that we're getting now. So we use time value of money calculations to sort that out. And two ways to do it is the net present value of this cost compared to this benefit. You can't look at just the average value, and sometimes they're presented that way. The internal rate of return is looking at the interest rate that makes the two equal. So how much can we say that this benefit is earning off of this expense internally? That's what the internal rate of return is. That's what those high numbers are. So if we only have one investment, like your stock portfolio, you invest at the beginning, the rate of return for the rest of that portfolio, it is something you could compare to this internal rate of return. It's just that we have years and years of costs to sort out as part of that calculation. So there's a reason I'm going through 1.5 million. I'm part of a research team that's spending 6 million over 4 years. So that team, I was telling them, look guys, our cost is 1.5 million per year. If we're going to have an internal rate of return of 20%, the lowest rate for both Mala and Alston, we would have to generate a benefit after those 4 years of 1.6 per year for the next 30 years. If we had an internal rate of return of 80%, we'd have to generate a benefit of 14 million. There are innovations that do that. The hybridization and HT gains in canola relative to where the conventional canola was on path, they're now in the billions per year in gains. So the initial investment and a bunch of the private investments that have been that are still being made on those, they're generating huge benefits. So that internal rate of return is not out of whack given the small amount that the public sector was investing in canola at the beginning. But even Alston himself said, be careful. When you're trying to attribute the gains of productivity, there's a lot of things that are affecting productivity. You're observing a production number that farmers are adjusting because of current output prices. The current output price relative to the current input price. So that yield is moving up because of all of the innovations of farmers, all the investments on the private sector, which are way harder to measure than the public sector investments. So Alston himself says, beware of attributing everything that you couldn't measure to what you can measure. And as a plug for our own discipline of econometrics, we worry about that causality and sorting out endogenous processes within what we're observing all the time. Economists are very used to looking at big data sources that were generated by a system not imposed by trials, by those perfect randomized trials that you guys are used to. We're not used to that. We're used to trying to sort out the various things that are affecting the dependent variable we're interested in. And that's why I put this plug in. Jared Karlberg's course in 3080, Introduction to Econometrics, is an introduction to multiple variable regressions. And in Alan Krita Goswami's econometrics, you can learn even better where the breakdown of the linear models doesn't work. We've got solutions to that. And we're used to dealing with a lot of functional form and systems of equations that is actually very close to what we'll have to do with big data science in the future. Okay, to continue my story on innovation, this is from Alston in 2010, and he's showing how the first identification of hybrid corn as improving yields was identified in 1877. Hybrid corn was not widely adopted on US farmland until 1960. So 90 years from when the first invention happened to when a private sector system. So now that we've got hybrid corn and the corn seed growers can collect income from that seed production, there is private sector investment and private farmers are willing to pay for that improvement in yield. So the system has an engine of payment on the benefit side, but there was a huge period before that where we had to have the basic research before we could get the improvements in the applied side. This is Bt corn, the first identification of Bt having an impact on yields, 1901. Not adopted it was identified in Europe, not adopted by most countries until 2008. So even more than 100 years from first identification of a pattern to when it's widely adopted on the farm. So we have research lags. We also have adoption lags, but when the farmers first see it, they have to be convinced that it's improving them. And so there's adoption at the farm side. We have problems with intellectual property rights. Just because they're not always synced well, a patent lasts a certain time. Whether or not it is a good enough incentive for us to invent isn't always perfect. But we also have problems that a whole bunch of what we do as research, we're giving away so that the general stock of knowledge is improving. That's great. It does increase overall benefit in society, but we need society to pay for that research effort in the beginning. If there's no system out there that's going to pay for an excluded good, then the research itself can't get done. That's also part of a problem with farmer safe seed. So when there's a hybrid seed system, there's automatically a private incentive to improve the seed. But for a lot of crops, and even early on in herbicide-tolerant canola, Percy Schmeiser's court case was about him saving the technology on his farm. And he lost the court case, but his penalties weren't that high. I'm not sure it actually led to big income for Monsanto to go around and police that seed technology that they did for Percy. So the fact that farmers have been used to saving seed around the world, and in crops like pulses and most of our cereals, except for corn, saving that seed doesn't cost them very much in yield. So saving the seed doesn't even hurt them in terms of their on-farm returns. All of that leads to lower private sector investment, and that's why that public sector investment might be unusually high. If there was very high returns to the private sector, 80% returns on your portfolio, doesn't that sound like it'd be awesome? Let's go invest in that. We can't capture that because we can't go out there and measure the benefits from what we've invested. The public sector can, in a large way, they can keep the engine of growth going and tax Canadians, but that's the only people that can capture a whole bunch of the benefits from agriculture research. Okay. One thing, so there was the Plant Breeders Institute. We don't have too many people here in plant science, but I want to put a plug in for the Plant Breeders Institute. I think Peter McVetti actually trained there. But the Plant Breeder Institute was this wonderful engine of seed improvement in wheat, especially. I've got wheat yields up here. But it was located with Cambridge University, and it had both basic scientists at the time were figuring out the wheat genome and the barley genome. So they had these, really gifted geneticists and plant scientists all working with applied breeders. And the breeding revenues from the seeds, because they were identifying the best wheat varieties that the UK could come up with, the wheat sales, the seed sales for the wheat varieties in the UK were keeping the Plant Breeding Institute running, humming along just fine. And in fact, it was doing so well that Margaret Thatcher said, we've got a thing, we've got a seed breeding program that's earning all this income. She believed in private sector ownership of those kinds of assets. She sold off the applied part of the Plant Breeding Institute, and she severed that link between the basic scientists and the applied scientists. And look what happened eventually to wheat yields. The private incentive wasn't enough for Unilever at the time to keep investing in wheat seeds. And the big buyer of the plant breeding PBI's genome material was eventually Monsanto, and they just brought it into their big research engine, but they did not have an incentive to improve wheat yields in the UK. And they've tried some taxes on seeds, some type of systems that have been advocated here and are used in France and Australia, but they have not really solved the wonderful thing that they had. They've never brought back the wonderful institution that they had in the Plant Breeding Institute. And I want to say that when we removed Ag Canada from this campus, we did that. And if they're going to remove Ag Canada from the Saskatoon campus, they're going to hurt us that way too. And it would be terrible if we ever lost the Crop Development Center at Saskatoon. All of those places had this synergy between basic research and applied research that I think has been a really good thing in Canada. Okay. There is also returns to extension. I just wanted to point this out. Farm Management Canada, I'm part of their board, and they did a study on in 2017, most of these measures from 2017, but they also updated it in 2020. It's about the same. Their returns on asset of the top 25% of managers compared to the bottom 25% is 500% higher. The return on equity is 100% higher. The reason those two can be different actually is because those guys that are making 500% are paying a whole bunch in bank loans. But you can see that the top managers are doing way better than the bottom managers. These are type against type, about the same asset base, but you're seeing really big differences in gross margin. Higher gross margins means less claims at AgriStability, which runs on gross margin. And higher return on equity means increases in generational wealth because the managers are doing better. So the money on the table, and Farm Credit Canada has really bought into this. They have supported Farm Management Canada, but they're also doing their own extension, especially in terms of some of the big things that were identified that separated best managers from less well performing managers. One of them is lifelong learning skills. So this idea that we impose, or we suggest that our students become lifelong learners and scholars, you're giving any of them that end up in the ag sector on the farming side a leg up in terms of their future management skills. And then the stuff that we do in our farm plans, in the diploma program and in ABIS 1000, those plans that are drafted, they make farmers more successful as well. So big thank you to those people in terms of improving the future wealth of the farmers that are learning those different skills. And the more we could invest in that, the better our entire farm sector would be. We need better data. So I mentioned there's a whole bunch of things we don't know that might be improving yield. And we aren't measuring. We're not getting great measures of private sector R&D. We also aren't measuring very much in terms of what separates good farmers from bad farmers. We've got the Farm Management Canada survey, but we could get a lot better data. And Farm Management Canada actually has an initiative out there to harmonize the coding for taxes so that we can explore something that's going on in terms of differences in costs. There is a lot of literature in the US where we're trying to explain the productivity of farms using their cost information. That was a whole group of study. Production economics was really focused on cost functions for a long time because it was the only thing we could observe in the data, but we don't even have decent cost data anymore. Corporate farms file taxes different, and we don't learn as much as we used to from farm surveys. The other thing that's being used is aggregate data from farm programs. Ryan's here. Ryan did some of his work on productivity using crop insurance data. So he had at field by field level, yields with input levels that he could use within other data sources to sort the impact of the Canadian Wheat Board on productivity. So you can do a lot of stuff as long as we are allowed to see at least some of the aggregated data. I did want to put in a plug because these guys really care about the returns to agricultural research. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. Our time, there is a research hall on agriculture, or town hall on agricultural research. The place I found it was from the nfu.ca. We don't always see eye to eye, but on this thing we agree, and so do many producer groups. There's a whole bunch of people that signed on to this initiative. Okay. The theme of this seminar series is supposed to be on digital ag, and I do want to say that digital ag has all those problems I talked about in terms of endogeneity, that we have to use sort of multiple linear regressions to sort out and learn some of the techniques. There might be, in biometrics, very similar techniques, but we have some pretty good skills along those lines. And generally, there's just more data, so that can help us improve our understanding of productivity all over the place. But we do want to, when we're looking at data, a lot of times we're looking at it as the market is shifting. And so it is good to understand what the market is doing to the incentives on the farm, keeping that in mind. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the complications of just the interactions of inputs in the one project that I'm part of as a really big factor. So Keith Coble is at Mississippi State, and him and a group of people have written sort of an overview of the role of ag economics in digital ag. And he kind of points to the fact that we've been, as economists, working with a lot of physical scientists to understand production functions, better estimates of yield, and then putting all those things into our understanding of supply functions so we understand markets better. And so he thinks we have a really good skill set on the economic theory that drives the data we see, and then once we see the data on the data, the econometric techniques we have to sort out those patterns. So just a regular supply versus demand, they actually have two different impacts on price. As the price is going up, demand is going to be going down. As the price is going up, we hope the supply is going up. If we just observe price and quantity, we could not sort out what the demand and supply are. So we've got estimation systems for both those functions at the same time to help us try to sort out those two forces. And we have econometric systems that help us identify those systems. So we use things like 2- and 3-stage least squared and seemingly unrelated regressions and instrumental variables and anything else I should mention. I'm not the expert. Alan Critta is starting to teach some of that. But Keith's point is that we have a good grounding in understanding our industry on the theory of what we were observing, and we have good techniques in econometrics and sort of measuring the impact of one variable on another. Okay, so this is, now I'm going to switch over to my struggle where I am looking at lots of data, partly because the people in the rest of this group are incredibly productive. But I'm part of this bioinoculants and nutrient use efficiency project. It's a Genome Canada project, and the PIs are George DeScenzo at Queen's and Ivan Orezhnik in University of Manitoba at microbiology. And I'll go through what each one of these activities are sort of doing. So George and Matthew Batker here at Manitoba are looking at the many bugs that they could find, microbes in the soils of Manitoba that were collected by Matthew, and in Ontario that were collected by George. And they're trying to identify different microbes, and I think they've genotyped more than 1,000. And they're looking for ones that have a positive impact, potential as inoculants for wheat, barley, canola, and kale. And kale was in there because we had a greenhouse as part of the initial search. Ivan has already been kind of a leader in rhizobiums for legumes, and his focus has been on rhizobium isolations for dry beans and peas. And especially I think he's focused on dry beans where we're currently still using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. And this was one of the pitches for the Genome Canada project, was if we identified inoculants that could reduce the nitrogen fertilizer application, we could have an impact on nitrous oxide releases and have a greenhouse gas impact. I'm gonna take a little wind out of those sails later, but that was the big pitch. And Ivan has absolutely helped that in terms of peas and soybeans in Manitoba. And then Terence Bell is working on optimizing those genotypes that we've identified in an industrial production process. So he's stabilizing the genotypes so that farmers can apply them on their fields and get some of the same benefits that have been identified right now in controlled greenhouse conditions. And some of them, so George he's growing seeds, and their only thing they're allowed to, they're just sitting in air, and their only nitrogen source is from the air, and they get the inoculant, so they just die if they don't fix nitrogen, which is a really, really unusual growing condition for a seed. But Olivia Wilkins, also microbiology at the U of M, and Yvonne Lawley and Kirsten McMillan are part of her team doing field trials. But most of what they have been doing is controlled greenhouse plants, and they're looking at whether or not these inoculants are having those impacts on the same crops, wheat, barley, canola, and kale. And I'm eventually going to get to that activity 5 that I'm actually part of. But all of the stuff that they've learned in terms of the genomes is going to be part of the Canadian Collection of Agricultural Soil Microbes. So they're creating a knowledge stock that can have an impact on the future productivity of farmland for a long time. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how I think that could easily generate tens of millions of dollars in benefits for years. So in every Genome Canada project, there's the GELS component, which includes ethical, environmental, economic, legal, and social aspects. There's a little bit of social stuff being done by Jill Hobbs. There's a little bit of legal stuff that Mohammed Adam might get into in terms of the plant breeders' rights, or sorry, not plant breeder rights, but intellectual property rights, if that could adjust the viability of an inoculant firm. And ethics are definitely a concern because we're dealing with all the bugs in soils, so some of them it could actually have a negative impact on yield. So we have to be very careful that you're not going to create some new fusarium and spread it around the soil zones. I'm not saying they are very careful for that. They're essentially only identifying and sharing ones that have a positive impact on yield. But there is a lot of concern about the safety and environmental impacts of these inoculants. So I'm working on farm-level simulations, the economic choices of farmers. Neil Scott at Queen's is working on life cycle analysis of the sort of tracking the greenhouse gas emitted from the entire building of inoculants. Then once they're adopted, the impact at the farm level. Warren maybe is working on that as well, and looking at the impact of future greenhouse gas policy that might have an impact on the viability of inoculant use. Sabine Liebenen was at University of Saskatchewan when we started. She's now with Switzerland's government ag research group, but she's still part as an adjunct at the she's still part of some farm level surveys. So Sabine and Jill Hobbs at University of Saskatchewan are doing farm surveys that will encompass some of the simulation results that we do at the University of Manitoba. And then Jill and Yang are also doing consumer studies to see whether or not consumers would consume more goods consume more food if it was produced using less greenhouse gases. So they're doing on sort of a consumption impact study. So one of the big models that Neil is using, and I think Warren is going to encompass it, is the DayCent model, which is trying to track yields, greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur inputs, yields, and I think I already talked about, and the storage that's happening in soils. The part 2 includes both Sabine and Jill's farmer survey and my economics stuff, and then the consumer impacts, all Jill and Yang at the University of Saskatchewan. So the first thing that we did we actually started to do some of this work as part of the grant application. So me and Janaya Buchanan worked on farm-level simulations of 2 strains that had already been identified at the University of Manitoba. One was a soil-solubilizing bacteria. They had 4 years of trials. They had increased wheat yields between 6 to 24%, depending on the levels of phosphorus that were in the soil. Then there was also an antifungal bacteria. So most of the interactions we have focused on have been, actually most of them have been on nitrogen. Phosphorus has an interaction with a phosphorus-soluble bacteria as well, but because nitrogen was our worry on greenhouse gases, that's where a lot of the focus has been. But we can have a yield impact from a phosphorus-based bacteria and an antifungal-based bacteria, which is really, you have to model a disease outbreak to model the benefits of that one. But just to identify the potential for the market, if we looked at this, there was 5.7 and 6% were the bottom of the trial results in terms of yield impacts. That's a key to what we started to simulate after. I guess I didn't present too much of that, but if we looked at the inoculants that are out there already and the claims they make, most of them are claiming at least 5% yield gains, although it's very stochastic. Meaning that if the inoculant's already in your soil, you add the inoculant, it has almost no impact on yield. So you don't, unless you get a very good test for the presence of those inoculants, that's another, perhaps an innovation that's necessary. But once it's identified as a need, it could have a very big yield impact. But if there's somebody else out there that's offering that already for less than what it's going to cost you to produce it, then your new innovation, your new strain might have a value of 0. So there's a, 0 could be the value on that green part of the benefit side. We can't guarantee that they'll all be adopted, but even a very small level adoption on the wheat and canola area in North America could generate yearly returns at the farm level of 8.4 million. Sorry, that's the inoculant firm. They would be making 8.4 million a year. So that would easily cover the cost of the benefit project in terms of the benefits that an inoculant firm would get. The possible returns to the inoculant firm could go higher if we have higher prices for the final good and if it's adopted on a wider group. And then the value of the firm can be greatly affected by if they have a patented process that gives them a cost advantage and keeps them ahead for a longer period of time. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to work on in terms of modeling is the games that the inoculant firms might play once we understand the demand on the producer side. So we do want to understand the demand better. This is just flagging some of the recent biological acquisitions that have already happened. So when they're, the 22 million, the 15 million, these ones are most likely, or what we understand, they're most likely trading on traits. So they're buying a few strains. When it's billions or hundreds of millions, that's usually patented processes that they're paying for. So they're paying for new technology that can help them improve all their biological offerings. So that's one of the things that will inform the game in the future. But also that the strains were at least valued at about 15 million. So our estimate of long-term value of 100 million might be too high. Okay, so this is Manitoba Ag's budgets that were released at Ag Days in January. Sorry, forget when it was, January, February. And you can see that things are kind of tight. Most of our crops are not profitable as of that date. Things have improved for canola and soybeans, got worse for corn and stayed the same for wheat. So corn and soybeans are actually a lot more profitable than they were because of current prices. Last year, the only crop at that time was making money was pinto beans. But if we have an inoculant that increases the yield by just 5% and only costs $5 an acre, which is the cost that we were looking at in terms of providing the ones for the strains that we got from the University of Manitoba, we would increase the profit and we'd see big gains in margin for every crop that's there. But we went from having only 2 crops that were profitable to having only 3 that are not profitable. So the adoption's likely if the farmers are going to move from loss to profit. That's one thing. That's all I really wanted to say, except canola is now doing better than all the rest because that we're now making about $15.50 a bushel rather than $14.25. Soybeans are also up. I also wanted to point out, because we're going to talk about the interactions of nitrogen fertilizer and the returns on the farm level in a minute. But there's big differences in the revenues themselves, but there's also big differences in the operating costs. So the profit level of the farm is being affected by those differences. So a 5% yield difference creates a range of margin gains. It's not because the operating costs are different. Even the fixed costs are a little bit different for crops that have special technology as part of seeding or harvest. Okay, but I did want to point out two things, that the average Manitoba farmer is using 0 nitrogen in soybeans, 0 nitrogen in peas. So that target that Ivan has for dry beans has happened already in 2 crops. But there's a lot of nitrogen being added to corn, canola, and wheat, and those things are all possibly generating nitrous oxide gases. Okay, so to kind of get back to that interaction stuff that I was trying to sort out, the economic impacts of interactions of various inputs. This is a study done from Kansas State University. And the reason I'm putting it up for it, I think officially said there was no significant gain, but these were the average gains. You can see that at low levels of nitrogen, the inoculant increases yield, which it's proven is a nitrogen fixing bacteria. So you would hope that it would increase yields in the presence of no nitrogen. It has an incentive to go fix nitrogen and improve the plant's viability. But at higher levels of nitrogen, that fixation is wasting some of the resources of the soil. I'm definitely in areas where I might be wrong here, Bailey, so don't let me say the wrong thing. But theoretically, you could have a period where the inoculant is having less impact and maybe even a negative impact on yield. And then as we increase nitrogen in this case, it is possible, and it's certainly possible for something like the phosphorus solubility bacteria, where you're making the nutrients more available to the plant, that as you're adding more fertilizer, you're actually improving yield with the inoculant in place. Okay? So given that this is a possible scenario for the impact of an inoculant choice and yields, how do we model that economically? First off, a lot of the stuff that we've assumed of on inputs is that we have some diminishing impact of adding an input. An inoculant is a binary input. It's yes, no. You add it if it's not there, and sometimes, stochastically even, you add it and it has no effect. So that's all stuff that we have to worry about when we add it into the system. But you can see that it's also interacting with nitrogen fertilizer. So we have to look at those interactions. Olivia is exploring some of those interactions in the greenhouse. So we do want to incorporate them into the strains we see. So the first step I did was to estimate my own. I needed a smooth version of the function. So I estimated it. These are both quadratic estimations, then they look pretty close, right? They look similar. So this is my yield generated by levels of nitrogen fertilizer with and without the proven inoculant. And then I imposed current corn prices, the current price of proven, and the current price of nitrogen fertilizer into this model. And so now I have the profit, the gain in margin at least, of the value of the crop yield minus the cost of the nitrogen fertilizer and the proven inoculant. And you can see that in this model, the most profitable outcome is actually without the inoculant at 90 pounds of N. So in this case, we would see no impact on nitrous oxide because the inoculant itself isn't a positive economic choice. Adding the inoculant at that level is actually reducing yields. Okay? If I increase corn prices, which I'm increasing them by 200%, which corn prices have done in the last 4 years. They've been 200% higher. If I do that, then the highest possible profit is adding that inoculant into the system and using a huge amount of nitrogen fertilizer. So George's pitch to Genome Canada is to say, hey, let's use more inoculants and we'll use less nitrogen fertilizer, isn't correct for this scenario. We might actually use more nitrogen fertilizer. Now, the soil scientists might say that if the inoculant is there, maybe the nitrous oxide releases have changed, or maybe Descent can help us work that out. So I'm not sure it has an impact or positive or negative impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but it absolutely leads to higher levels of nitrogen fertilizer, which is costly to the whole system. Okay, we could also have really high nitrogen prices. So if nitrogen prices get high enough, then we add no nitrogen and we just use the proven inoculant to generate the nitrogen for the system, which is where this is the prevailing system in soybeans and peas. Their profit levels are way better than this because the inoculants there work way better. So they're highly profitable without any nitrogen added. But this is corn being grown with a nitrogen fixer. Okay, unfortunately, you can look at the graph as at current prices. You can see that the maximum level is just a little over 160. I can make that proven inoculant almost nothing, and it has almost no impact on whether or not I use it because it's got a negative impact on the nitrogen. So using the inoculant is actually moving me away from that optimum point. So it doesn't really matter what the cost of the proven inoculant is. We won't adopt it at current prices. So all of this means that the prices, the combination of the input prices and the output prices are having a huge impact on the levels of input we're measuring. Okay, so if the prevailing prices are like low proven, if the prevailing prices are like this, we're only going to observe 0 N and lots of inoculant use. If the prevailing prices are like this, we're going to get a lot of observations of high levels of nitrogen and high levels of yield. And this is all in that big data set that we're trying to sort out. And if the prevailing prices are like this, we won't get any inoculant use. It doesn't mean that that's not a really important choice variable for farmers, but it is something we have to worry about when we're looking at big data sources. Okay. One more thing on estimating those functions. So I estimated it with a quadratic. I tried it with just a log, natural log on the yield, natural log on the fertilizer, which is how a lot of yield models work. And notice there's no, in my other option, nitrogen fertilizer, the inoculant was better at low levels. This is actually saying that's not the case. Using exactly the same data set, I generate a pretty different line. And if I use this in my simulations, inoculants would be adopted, and our optimal levels would always be very high levels of nitrogen, much higher levels of nitrogen fertilizer than, and we're using the inoculant. So just choosing the functional form is important. That's something that some of our production economics classes can help talk you through. The most general form, well, the one that we consider quite a general form is the translog, which has log nitrogen, and it could also have log squared and log times the inoculant or other inputs. So that's the more general form, which might have given me a better estimate. But lots of yield models are using log of yield against the log of your input. And that is forcing you into this kind of functional relationship, which may not be the way the actual impact is. Another thing we've worked on this, but I just wanted to put a plug in that another thing that could factor into our yields are just the previous crop. So if I plant canola on canola, that's going to have an impact on yield. So the previous crop could have an impact on the yield. If we're trying to, if we get our hands, we do have our hands on some crop insurance data. We have the previous crop's impact on the next crop. That can have an impact on yield. So that can be factored into the estimated economic impact it's going to have the previous crop or at least the rotations in the area that are holding, say what kind of impact other crops in the rotation are having on yields. We can also include weather patterns in a risk area, the soil zones of individual crops, and the whole pool of inputs that are being used out there. The more we learn about the inputs that we can measure, the better we understand that yield that we're trying to have an impact on. So, a couple of things. 0 is a possible outcome, but so might be 100 million a year. So I just wanted to say that's out there, The effect on inoculant firms is hugely affected by whether or not they win against the competitors out there, whether or not it's widely adopted, and that adoption is probably affected by the efficacy of the inoculant itself. So we have to worry about that efficacy and the stochastic nature of that, also the stochastic nature of those interactions, and the relative prices of output, inputs, and all the other crop choices that are out there, and their rotational impacts on yields. And there's also impacts just in the growing regions of Manitoba. The average yield that I presented there was a provincial average. We could have regional averages, which could affect the demand for the inoculant in different regions. So the more we understand that, the more we can understand the value of the strains as an economic good and as a future demand for inoculant firms. How am I on time? I was going to just, so we are going to try to do what I just talked about. We're especially looking at interactions between phosphorus and P-soluble inoculants. And Warren and Neil are suggesting potential greenhouse gas taxes and credits that could be part of the system. I was going to say, hey, canola prices are really variable, but you guys all know that. And so those are all having a big impact. They were, when we first did some of the studies that Janaya worked on, we were looking at prices in the $800 a ton for canola, and now they're in the $600 a ton. But you can see the variation's been huge. And it has an impact on another area of my interest that is using forward contracts for pricing, but I won't go through that story because we're kind of close on time, and I'll stick to this interaction between physical science and ag economics. So that's it. These are some of the sources on the returns to research. These are some of the sources I used on inoculants and precision ag. And that's it. Oh, these are the guys that helped fund the benefit project. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're
Derek,
welcome.
enjoyed that. Any questions from the audience?
Yes.
So there was this distinction you were making between hybrid corn and then wheat corn coming into the market. Now, if we start drawing parallels from this world of, corn and hybrid seeds, varieties, etc., to now something like digital ag, creating its own economy. So, if we look at that field, like genetic engineering, etc., there are big players in that market, and the scales are very different now, but those scales have been largely dominated by the ABC forms of agriculture, what we call. Now with digital agriculture, what is your hypothesis? Like in the years to come, will we see similar patterns pop up where a few players in the market come to dominate digital ag, or will it be more like a democratic resource to the farmers where, even small and medium scales can be enterprising enough, and we can have those returns on those scales as well?
Okay, so, great question, and that really depends on the technology. And precision ag, it's very, digital ag, precision ag is really about being more precise. Yes, you're going to use an input more efficiently. And this is Dale Steele, who did some of the work on digital ag, a plan for our department. But these are zones of a field that might be losing money. And you could reduce the variable rate of your fertilizer in some of these areas. And overall, you're more profitable. I'm not sure you're totally more productive. You're going to be more profitable. It might not have an impact on productivity. But the cost of those systems are getting really low relative to their benefit of improving your profitability. So the people that are dominating that market are John Deere and Case. You get your whole system, but there is a private sector, and there is a private provider. That makes me think that the cost of providing it is not that high. And this is an add-on to the $1 million you're paying for the combine and the seeders. That's where they're going to make their money, and they're going to throw that service in because you're going to use it eventually, so why not use their data? And it helps them understand what you need it for in terms of if I can improve my returns by varying nitrogen, can I do that by adjusting seed? Well, they do this. They adjust seed depth or seed placement or all those things that they're gaining information in terms of improving their equipment too. So I think precision ag cost is low. And so I think adoption will be high, but I think the potential for it to have millions of dollars of impact on gains, not quite the same as hybrid corn. You have a question? Oh.
Yeah.
Hi, my question may be a little bit different in the context, like in Africa, in other developed countries, we also care about why and how the farmers would take and is kind of apply that to the ag. One of the reasons that they fail to do so is they don't actually understand, even accept, understand the fact that make that announcement. Tell them if you do that, and it's such a high gain, but in Canada or in North America, how could you send a trustable or convince them that this is true and they would do it? Like that message sending, how to make it more effective, and they would do the trial. That's my question.
Okay,
just area.
Yeah, just because it's getting recorded, I'll repeat that. Your question is about how do we improve trust in some of these innovations so that they're more widely adopted and maybe especially for developing countries. Honestly, I have no examples of success where what we have just identified was the reduction of ag research in Canada after we told them that there was huge returns to that. So I think the sort of the public's general skepticism about experts and scientists, and especially ag economists telling them that they should spend more money on ag research. We don't actually get very much ag research money compared to our physical science guys, but we're in the same faculty, and the dean might really like it if we do research like that. So, there's some concern of who's the incentive to get that research out there. But just looking at the inoculant, I think the potential for economic gains is huge relative to the cost. But there is in inoculants, it's very difficult to capture the returns because inoculants are live bugs in the soil. You're just identifying how to use them. So you can't patent the strain. That's why the value of strains are relatively low. You can patent the process. But in terms of what makes effective extension, there's a little bit in what Farm Management Canada found there, Tenda, is that lifelong learning is what drives producers to make really good managers. And I think that's one of the things, I mean, just getting useful information out there on the internet so that they can see how things are done. I don't know if those guys see stuff on YouTube, but they're starting to improve that all the time. But I'm sorry that most of my experience has been you tell policymakers, don't do this, and then they go ahead and do it anyways. So I'm not good at convincing that public sector investment.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in one of the figures, you showed that 90 pounds of nitrogen was the optimum, right?
Yeah.
Can you go back to that? I just need clarification.
Yeah, okay. So that's a Kansas, let's see where we were when I did that.
So it was mentioned like 90 pounds that
Yeah.
year. So it looks like I have roughly $20. So is that $20 including already the price for the nitrogen?
Yeah, it does. So that's the profit, the selling the corn at, I think it was about $5 a bushel. Yes, but this is not cost. This is the profit if I used proven. So and that's why at higher corn prices, that high yield up there starts to be more valuable and it's worth more. Yeah. Yes?
It's like, I know you were worried about the natural law results, but there's a lot of criticism from mathematicians and trying to avoid changing and distorting the scale. Because, that thing, you can't get an output for zero, anything
Yes, right.
above zero infinity scales.
Yes, right.
Yeah, so your raw results are probably better than your natural law. So
Thank you. Well, no, but I think that's a thing for us to consider when we're running a regression on results, and somebody has told us, well, yield is is you can kind of estimate it as a log linear, which is actually some of the yield stuff that we first observed. One of my students, when we were looking at for yields from the crop insurance data, almost everything we read was natural log against natural log, and so that's how we estimated it. But we were absolutely forcing a link in there. It's pretty good for fertilizer, but
Yeah, like
not binary. Yeah.
Literature shows that if you wanna say keep your zeros and you add like 0.11
Yeah.
or 0.01 or 0.001, it actually changes your beta value.
Yeah.
So you can get any value you want by changing how much
Okay.
little you're adding. So yeah, that's been a very recent discovery. So.
Okay, thanks. So do you know the most generalized form we can use?
Plus all regression.
Yes. Yeah, Woolridge would say that. Yeah.
The trick is all you gotta do plus all.
I thought it was something called generalized Leontief. Is that really old?
It's like 1980.
Other questions? Everyone's good. I've got one, Derek. So you said that you haven't done a good job of maybe convincing policy to go one way. Now that we're at this current stage in the recent announcements, is there any way to
Let's all go to the town.
reverse it? Or
Let's go to the town hall tomorrow and
Okay.
see what an NFU tells us. That
Yeah.
sticks in my craw as a Southern Albertan. I'm going to
Yeah.
go to an NFU meeting, but I think they're making a really good case, and they've got a lot of producer groups that are part of it. So that's one thing that they might tell us, and maybe somebody like Crystal can tell us better how to communicate to producers.
Okay. No other questions? Yeah, Trust.
Yeah, what evidence do we have so far that digital agriculture can actually contribute to long-term sustainability rather than the short-term yield optimization?
Well, that fact that they're using variable rate fertilizer, that graph that I had there, where there's regions where it doesn't pay to even plant, you've probably reduced nitrogen fertilizer added to soil that was not even productive. So it's, Don's in the room and Mario's made this case that if you use nitrogen fertilizer more efficiently, you're at least going to reduce the greenhouse gas per output. Not sure you reduce overall greenhouse gases if you start to make better, more efficient use of nitrogen fertilizer. You might still use more, but you're at least making less greenhouse gas per unit of output. Right, Don?
Right there.
Sorry to wake you up, Bub.
No other questions?
Yes. Quick one, Derek. Have you looked at precipitation in all of this?
Yeah. I mean,
Because that's really our yield limiter. It doesn't matter how much nitrogen you use, and it's also one of the big limitations to getting any of these bacterial inoculants to work.
Yeah,
They have to plant in Western Canada because it doesn't rain enough.
or sometimes it rains too much and it kills the bugs in the soil.
Not that often, but yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just learning. But yes, so the yield models that my student Yang was using in the crop insurance data, your big driver was precipitation measured through the summer and soil moisture at the beginning. Those two were big drivers of yield. You're right. And I think when Mustafa, when we're thinking about those yields, if you've got varying limiting factors, then if you run out of moisture, the next unit of nitrogen fertilizer has no impact. It could be a huge waste of money. And I highly recommend going to the Emily open days where they're talking about measuring the moisture in the water using tile drainage. Like they're triggering so many different types of inputs at once now. It's complicated to measure in terms of its impact on profitability, but it's really interesting in terms of the future for yield.
Maybe I can ask a question.
Sure.
How the risk played a role here? So how in the model do you take into consider any prices?
So the future simulations, we're going to have risk based on the prices, the distribution of prices, a distribution of, I don't think we're going to have growing degree days, but we might, but weather events. Those things will have a big impact on the yield that comes out. And so then it's a probabilistic decision at the beginning on whether or not to use the inoculant. And the efficacy of the inoculant itself is a risky choice. So all of them can be randomized based on whatever our research results are and put into the simulation of the farm. And I think it's one of the things that Jill is very much interested in asking farmers about, that if you face that much risk, are you going to bother investing in inoculants? The other side of risk, though, for the soybean guys, if they grew soybeans in their soil the last few years, or 2 years ago, there might be an inoculant there. But if it only costs me $5 to put it on, it's an insurance policy that the inoculant's there for my seed. So there's another risk trade-off that they can ask them about.
Thank you, Derek. We better wrap it up there. Let's thank Derek one more time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. We'll see you at the next one coming up in early April, I think.